Everyday injustice.
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have a simulcast, and we will be talking with some local activists working on police reform in Davis, California, my hometown. I have here Morgan Poindexter, Aarthi Sekar, Lupita Torres, and Dillan Horton. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
So I was hoping maybe we could go around the room here and everybody can explain the role that they've played in the discussion on policing.
Absolutely. So I'll go first. My name is Morgan Poindexter, and I got involved here this summer. I've always been sort of interested in criminal justice and kept really close tabs on the news and everything, but had really not ever gotten into local activism until this summer. And like everybody else, a real sort of moment of reckoning with all of the stuff that happened, starting with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And so I just got really compelled to get in there and actually do something. And so I started working with a group of researchers here in Davis. So I'm a UC Davis graduate student in immunology, so nothing to do with criminal justice, but we definitely look at data and analyze data and look at research, academic research, and go through papers and things like that. And there was a call for sort of that expertise. So that is where me and Arthy and some others, Julia Shaw, Jordan Varney, Caitlin French, Rowan Boswell, and others joined up to try to help the city of Davis, who put together a joint subcommission of the Police Accountability Commission, Human Relations Commission, and the Social Services Commission to reimagine public safety and what that might look like. And so we put together a presentation of how you would approach public safety from a social determinants kind of public health perspective. And then I really started digging deep into the DPD data on arrests and 911 calls, so calls for service. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. Arthy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Just following up on everything that Morgan said, I'm also, a community member at UC Davis, PhD student, studied something completely different. I study genetics and genomics in humans, but again, I couldn't ignore the sort of moral imperative this year to really respond to police brutality in our communities, and just the time is now. And so I really wanted to kind of step up and was able to join this lovely group of researchers and kind of just contribute my skills that I've garnered during a course of graduate study work of reading lots of papers and trying to contribute what I can in terms of summarizing what's already been done to do criminal justice reform and policing reform, and just contribute to the conversation. And so that's what brings me here.
And Dylan?
Yeah, good afternoon, evening. I'm not sure when the cutoff is sometimes. But yeah, my name is Dillan Horton. I originally got involved with criminal justice and policing issues, specifically in Davis, I guess, around the aftermath of the Picnic Day 5 incident. A number of activists and organizers in the community were trying to, number one, support the people who had been charged, we thought sort of wrongly, for assaulting police officers in a situation that's too complicated to get into now, but I think most listeners of this podcast will be at least somewhat aware of that incident a number of years ago. And folks picketed outside of City Hall. They came down to sort of fill the aisles of public comment at city council meetings to demand some sort of, number one, accountability for the specific sort of situation that had happened there, but a sort of a system change that made incidents like that less likely in our community. And the sort of community conversation and sort of outreach process that the city underwent during that time led to the creation of the Police Accountability Commission and the reforms of the previous police ombudsman position that's now the independent police auditor. I was one of the original appointees to the Police Accountability Commission when we were, I guess, impaneled in December of 2018. I guess I should roll back a little bit before that, but a lot of us, or some of us who were on the commission, were also involved in Dean Johansson's district attorney's campaign. I know it's a county level thing, but I just reference that because it involved really right before the commission got started, a lot of conversations with folks in the community right here in Davis and across Yolo County about what needed to change across the board in our criminal justice system here in Yolo County that had really harsh, it's like harsher than in other sort of nearby communities here in Northern California, really harsh impacts on brown and black communities here in Yolo County. Anyway, so that was a bit of some of the just situational experience that I had just before the commission got together. I was the vice chair of the commission in its first year and then became chair at the beginning of this year. Obviously, you know, Morgan sort of, actually both of y'all sort of referenced the sort of national situation that we were in after the murder of George Floyd and a number of others just in the summer of this year. I think there were a lot of folks in Davis who were like looking for some sort of leadership, looking for some sort of thing to get behind, you know, initiatives to back and to push. And so a lot of sort of organizers that I had worked with in the past got together to organize what was called the March for Justice. We sort of led out from Central Park with a number of people sharing their stories of sort of racial profiling and sort of the civilian context here in Davis, but also experiences with the police here in Davis. And we had also you know, a family who had been victimized by Woodland police also there at the event. We marched through downtown to the Davis Police Department, and a number of advocacy organizations, you know, folks like People Power, ACLU, YOLO chapter, and others sort of listed out demands for change in our system here in Davis. And what the whole point of that sort of very long, very hot event is to sort of focus our energy locally in what we needed to do to reform the system and to get its sort of structures changed. And the sort of demands listed out by groups like NAMI YOLO and others in front of the police department that afternoon sort of, at least for me, became the outlines for what we needed to propose here in Davis. And I sort of tried to be clear and consistent on that. And I think that means separating these things that we would traditionally call social services or, you know, community services away from armed law enforcement, you know, i.e. we don't want someone delivering those services, showing up in a police uniform and with a gun. But we also, I think, should separate, and I think this is necessary for a number of reasons that I hope that I'm sure we'll discuss later, but we have to separate these services and the sort of staff involved with them from the administration of the police department entirely. And I think that's really important. So I am one of the 4 members of the Police Accountability Commission that has been sort of sent as ambassadors to this triplicate subcommittee that Morgan referenced earlier, that includes members of the Police Accountability Commission and the Davis Social Services Commission to put forward recommendations to the City Council, I guess, in our best estimation of what we need to do to reform the process here. I you know, should just say, I think this is a little bit punting the ball. There was, you know, 90 minutes plus of public comment at the City Council's June budget meeting, where members of the community had very clear demands about what change they wanted to see. And the City Council took the action of creating this subcommittee at that meeting. And it's been, you know, an interesting and sort of up and down process as we sort of led from earlier this June until now, but that's where we are, and that's sort of the role that I play in this subcommittee.
Great, thank you, Dylan. Lupita, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Lupita Torres, and I am a Davis resident. And I've was one of the first peoples to help with the formation or the foundation, I guess, of the Police Accountability Commission. Myself, along with hundreds of community members, we facilitated several meetings and forums across Davis to get testimony and also hear from the impacted communities of the situation we have with the Davis Police Department and addressing the issues of discrimination and some profiling that was going on. And so I ran the low income forum and attended the Native American and one other forum, but I forgot what it was. But anyhow, so I did have a chance to hear from actual impacted peoples. And I am also a survivor of police harassment and abuse. So I, you know, speak diligently on these things because I come from a lived experience. It's important for people to understand that. I do not hate the police. I really want to say that to everybody because I feel like there's this really wrong assumption that everybody that's doing work around defunding the police and things of that nature are against the police. No, we are not against the police. You know, some of us have a family in law enforcement, including myself. However, I am against corruption within any police department and the abuse of power that goes along with that. So I don't think that the police should be concerned about people raising awareness on this issue being against them. I think they need to be more concerned with, you know, some of the existing corruption in the police department. So that's where I'm coming from. And I go against the grain sometimes with what folks in Davis might, you know, want, but know that I'm always in support of the communities that I represent, you know, which are the disenfranchised, the vulnerable frontline communities in Yolo County. And so that's my experience. That's where I'm coming from. And so I just, you know, I hate to speak in public on these things. You know, I really am super shy and I really don't want to be putting my neck out there on the chopping board, but, you know, somebody's got to do it, right? And, you know, you have people all across history that, you know, have had to do that. And that's what it entails. So I'm willing to go the extra mile and to get this thing done. And it's been an issue since I moved to Davis. I've been a community resident off and on for about 20 years now. And it started when I was attending UC Davis here in the early 2000s. And back then it was really bad. So there have been some improvements and I support the work that everybody's doing. And hopefully we can get some real change in our community.
Great. So I wanted to give a little bit of background. Dylan had mentioned the 2017 Picnic Day event, but actually there are some events that preceded that event. And when I was on the Human Relations Commission back, I want to say 2013, 2014, there was an incident where there was an African-American gentleman who was mowing his lawn in West Davis. And a police officer approached him and asked him for his ID. He's on his lawn. And the guy was really offended. He ends up going into his house and the officer realized as, you know, he's basically walking into his house that this was not the guy that he was looking for. They were, it turned out that they were looking for a burglary suspect, and somebody had seen a black man in Davis and jumped to conclusions. So this is kind of a Karen situation before we knew what a Karen was, right? And so when you know, we pushed. It wasn't Chief Pytel back then; it was Assistant Chief Pytel. But we pushed him for police stop data. And, you know, we had this kind of prolonged discussion, and we realized at that time that that was, we would have gotten some of that data, but we ended up deciding to do this this kind of restorative justice process between people of color and the leadership of the police department. And from that, it was like a year-long process. And from that, they created the alternative complaint resolution process. But we've been trying to get data on police stops, and actually this goes back 2006 when my wife was the chair of the Human Relations Commission, and they ended up getting shut down. They had requested police stop data, and the police at that time said that, sorry, we had this data and we threw it out because we didn't know what to do with it. I know. So then in 2000, I want to say I think right around 2017, right after Picnic Day, we had a couple of public events, and we pushed the Davis Police Department again to release traffic stop data. And at that time, the state legislature had just passed, I forget what the legislative number was, maybe one of you guys knows. And they said, well, we got to get that out by 2021. So at that time, I put in a public records request for the traffic stop data. And amazingly enough, I got the request in, I want to say May or June of this year, like 3 years after I sent out the request.
Wow.
And we finally got the data, and this is the data that you guys ended up analyzing. And you know, I guess to their credit, they got it out like a year earlier than they were required to by law. But I wanted to put that background in so that you guys understood, because I know most of you weren't here, you know, back in 2006. This is a really long fight and process that took a long time for us to get. So I wanted to kind of put that out there as kind of the background, and then ask, you know, because I know you guys did really good work at analyzing this data and starting to look at it. And so that's really what I wanted to discuss here now. So what have we learned now from this data that now that we finally have it?
Yeah, can I ask a clarifying question? So when you received the data, did you get raw data or their report, which is the publicly available report that's on the city's website?
I believe I got the publicly available report that was on the city's website, but at least we got something.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's 2019. And so I think that's a good point that we should make when talking about transparency. And again, like you were saying, I mean, this goes back to a fundamental right of the public to have this information and to have it in a timely manner. In our process, I found that the city of Davis and the Davis Police Department is fine with, at times, which you've learned, putting out data which is an analysis themselves. So putting out charts and graphs that they've put together. Sometimes they have tables which have actual, you know, number values, but really an analysis and not any of that raw underlying data, which basically puts us in a place where we can't really check whether what they're saying is true or not. And that's super frustrating. And so we have been attempting to get the raw data. And one thing that I stress is, so I come from Arizona. So I moved to Davis in 2016. I guess I should give that perspective. But I come from Arizona and I lived there my whole life. And there are some really problematic, really, really terrible police departments in Arizona. And even some of the worst ones, sorry, Phoenix PD, they even put out raw data and they update it every single day. It's publicly available. It's a database. You can click on it, download it every single day at 11 a.m. It's there without fail. and they are dealing with a massive population, right, too. So that's a huge endeavor. So I guess to start off this conversation, I would say I don't really understand why a city of this size, with the crime rates that we do have, which violent crime is like, I think the newest rate is 1.7, which is very, very low. And property crimes is a little bit higher, but I'm not sure why we don't have that level of transparency. So I would say that's the first thing that the police department could do to start this conversation and start it in good faith. But to talk about what we learned, I think it comes as no surprise that there are racial disparities that we see in that data, whether it's stops or whether it's arrests, even in who is searched when you're stopped. The arrest rates, the stop rates for Black people in Davis or who are stopped by DPD are 4.5 times higher than for white individuals who are stopped, right? And this is the perception of the officer of whose race it is, but and for Hispanic people, Latinx people, it's 1.7 times more likely. So that is a huge disparity. That is significant. And then if you look at who's searched, it's slightly higher for the Black people in Davis. It's 4.7 times more likely to be searched than a white person. And so that's unacceptable to me. And if you look at arrest rates, it's right in that same area. It's 4.4 times more likely for someone who is Black. And actually, let me step that back a little bit. So we first did an analysis of looking at total arrests, which is a logical place to start. But we got some feedback from DPD saying, well, in actuality, using the population numbers, that's how you normalize to population is how you would get an arrest rate. That doesn't really work because there are people from out of town. So we redid the analysis and looked at just Davis residents who were being arrested by the Davis Police Department. And we saw the same trends, almost in the exact same numbers. So again, it's 4.4 times more likely to be arrested in Davis if you're a Black Davis resident versus if you were white. And that's just, again, just on its face, unacceptable. And that number jumps up to 6.2 times more likely if you're looking at just felony arrests, which actually is just really terrible. So that's some of the racial disparities that we've seen in the data. As far as, I think I touched on this, but as far as what crimes are being committed in Davis, it's not violent crimes. Violent crimes make up a very small percentage of the total crimes that are happening here. We are on every single year's top 100 safest cities in California to live in. And the only reason we're lower on that list is because we have a little bit higher property crime rate. And so that's bike thefts or more serious thefts, but right, anything to do with theft. And so really from my perspective, and again, what we've seen in the data, we looked at calls for service, is that a large percentage of the time they are not responding to 911 calls, or they're not responding to incidents which involve a violent crime. There's a little bit of debate over the percentages, but it's less than 5% if you are very, very generous with your numbers, right? So yeah, I guess I'll let someone else jump in.
And I'll just add that, one of the things that the data tell us, what I was saying is that for years, we've heard anecdotal stories from African Americans, especially Latinas as well, that they've been stopped. In fact, I have kind of a running joke that I've never met an African American who spent any time in Davis that doesn't have a police story. I mean, it's pervasive. And so what these data show us is what we had been hearing anecdotally for years. It's just nobody had ever put the numbers on it. So I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of jump in with that.
Yeah, well, especially too, I mean, you look at the, if you look at when you're stopped, again, I said, if you're Black in Davis, you're much more likely to be searched by police. After, you're much more likely to be stopped, right? But then if you look at the whether they find contraband or not during those interactions, there's no difference in the percentage of time that you find contraband, which would maybe, I guess, be the argument, or could be an argument for why you would maybe be stopping certain individuals or another. I think it's a bad faith argument, if I'm frank, but that would be a way that you could look and say, okay, well, maybe are we finding a lot more stuff on these people when we stop them? And so that's why we need to keep stopping them. No, you don't. I mean, that is what the data says. It's actually, you're less likely to find contraband on a Black or Asian person that has been stopped and searched than you are for a white person. So it's actually slightly higher if you're white. So the argument there doesn't work for me.
And that's the stop and frisk finding too, right? That people of color are more likely to be stopped, but white people are more likely to actually have the contraband.
Exactly.
And just David, to that point, I think it's important to note here that these trends really do reflect the sort of national picture here, right? That in terms of, you know, the sort of bias in like what's a threat and who's sort of a criminal is similar to what we see in other communities. These sort of biases in the stops, in the searches, and, you know, in the sort of arrest are the same ones that we see, you know, in other communities, not just across California, but across the country. And the reason I think that's important for us to, you know, spend some time reflecting on is there's a lot of, and, you know, people who've heard me talk about this have heard me talk about this a lot this summer. There's a lot of distance that we, as Davisites, sort of put between ourselves and what are just, you know, baseline American issues of racism and of, you know, misogyny and sort of all the other isms that we, I think, as educated Davisites, understand exist across the country, but there's just this sort of bubble, I guess, that we assume that sort of exists over Davis that prevents those things from getting into our community. And so I think it's important for folks to realize that this conversation about Black Lives Matter, this conversation about defunding the police, this conversation about, like, you know, 400 years of systems of oppression and subjugation, that's not a America minus Davis conversation. That's a Davis and the rest of the country conversation, and I think folks have to look at the information that way and organize their own actions based on that.
Absolutely. And I think that gets to the heart of one of the sort of impediments to progress that I've seen, especially this summer, just in this work, that really slows things down, is this Davis exceptionalism, right? And if we think about the data too, because that's where my head goes all the time, it's really, really important to stress that the data shows that it's a problem, but the data can't capture everything that's happening. So the fact that the data shows that there's that much of a problem, what's not reported has to be much worse. I mean, you don't have anybody writing down every single time that they disrespected someone when they showed up to a scene. You don't have microaggressions written down. You don't have every time, you know, an officer puts his hand on his gun when he approaches someone, you know, of a certain race and not another. I mean, you don't have that data. That data doesn't exist. So the problem is a lot larger than the data shows. And again, like Dillan is saying, it's not the United States minus Davis. It is Davis is a part of the United States. Davis has police officers who exist within a system which was from its foundation racist. And so we need to recognize that. It's uncomfortable as white people, but we need to be clear about that.
And I think, you know, you raised the an important point that I hadn't thought of quite in the term that you used, Davis exceptionalism. What I've seen as a white person who's lived here in Davis for now 24 years is that as a white person, I personally have not had any problems with the police. I get treated well. Unfortunately, I've had lots of contacts this year with them, but you know, my experience personally is very good. It was only when I started first through my wife's work, seeing stories of people of color, and then personally working with people of color in this community, that I realized that there are really two types of justice in Davis. One for white people and one for people of color. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but I have seen it way too many times that people of color get treated very differently than I do and my family does.
And if I could just follow up on that just briefly, I think the reason that I focus on this, and not to speak for Morgan, but I could assume the reason that Morgan focuses on this too, is that it's not that we're trying to sort of label Davis as this like exceptionally mean town. It's just that there is this, I think part of it, David, like you say, is this, it's not people's lived experience for given the demographics of our town. It's not most people in Davis's lived experience to have, sort of focused and sort of traumatic sort of relationships with local policing. And it is, as Morgan said, a barrier to us moving forward. This sort of ingrained picture of our community that doesn't have these problems makes it hard for when, a group of folks like us are saying, wow, we need some really like change, not even knock down all the walls, like reconstruct this thing from the foundation sort of change. We seem like crazy people. Because the picture that we describe, the change, the sort of picture that we describe that justifies this change is not something that people are familiar with, most people, including like senior decision makers. And that does become a barrier for us moving forward. And so I just wanted to, clarify that's why people of color who are sort of operating in this space, but also people who are just aware of the experiences of people of color who are operating in this space, focus on just putting these stories out in front of people, because it's people's lack of understanding in our community has really become a barrier to progress.
So let me ask you guys this, because I think we've kind of fleshed out the concerns. What is the answer here? How do we fix policing in Davis? And don't get into defund yet, because that's going to be the second part of this discussion. But just in terms of police stops and bias policing, how do we solve that? Or do we?
Well, I would say, I'd like to speak on this a little bit. There's different types of diversionary programs. There's the CAHOOTS model that has been referenced several times during the meetings with the Yolo County Board of Supervisors. And in Portland, Oregon, they have work that they do with the mental health communities and organizations to help the police when they have a mental health crisis intervention situation. There's also other models in Camden, New Jersey, Denver, Colorado, and in Dallas, Texas. There's something called the STAR. I was just informed of today. I don't know too much about it, but if you want to go ahead and put that in a web browser and Google it, there's different types of alternatives to addressing the concerns of the community. And we don't have to put people in jail the way that we're doing it right now. Finland has a very good incarceration model. I mean, it's not even incarceration, really, it's rehabilitation. So for me, it's always a question of how are we going to rehabilitate these people? Sorry, it's my son in the background. How are we going to, and that's why I fight hard for this little guy here. Little, Native American boy with, darker skin. I know he's going to get targeted if we continue living in Davis. And so that's my motivation. But I know that there's different models in different cities. And like I said, Finland has a very good, one of the most progressive, quote unquote, prison models. So, I mean, there's lots of options. It's not very hard to do the research. We just have to want to do it. The hardest part is to make the police understand that it's not necessarily we are against them. We do not want corruption in the police department. And if they want to continue receiving funding from taxpayers, there needs to be a big, huge, just lens put on this whole system. That's the data, the facts, the evidence are there. There is racial discrimination in Yolo County. There is, there's a lot of things that need to be done, and we need to want to do them. And we have to decide right now where we want our money to go. And it's not about defunding the police or even divesting and investing. It's doing the right thing, because people are dying. They're getting angry and upset. And the point I want to make is that this anger, as we saw in West Sacramento, can turn into types of violence that we don't want our country to spiral into. So that's why this conversation needs to be at the forefront. We need to build a bridge between law enforcement and the community and provide real solutions, because we are literally getting shot out here. And when we call the police, we're often not supported. And I'm going to tell you, yes, it happens in Davis, and it happened to me this year. So me just coming out here and talking about it, I'm at risk of not getting help when I call on the police. It's already happened. But like I said, some of us just have to put our necks out on the chopping board, right? But that is not fair. So we just have to do what is just, fair, have honesty and integrity in our police departments, and hold them accountable when there's bad behavior. Thank you.
I just want to, number one, second all of Lupita's comments. I think just to add two other things here, I think number one, we have to change some things that are sort of outside of Davis's jurisdiction with regard to accountability. This police bill of rights, God help us, has to be addressed at the state level. And so, you know, it's going to be really difficult to really set up the accountability in police for when there are problems, for weeding sort of these, I hate the, bad apples. I think probably all of us do. But if we had sort of better systems of accountability that were available to us under state law, then we could sort of create those systems here in Davis. And I think that is a big sort of obstacle toward, or in the way of us making these, sort of weeding the bias out of the system. I've talked a lot about, a good chunk of my family professionally worked in healthcare. And there's all these dang, nursing boards and, pharmacy boards and boards of medicine, in the different states that have, all of these systems of accountability. If you just mess up just a couple of times as a nurse or as a doctor, as any number of other healthcare professionals, you're dragged before this board and you have to answer for what you've done and for the people that you've harmed through your negligence or whatever else. And again, just creating systems that look like that in law enforcement that I think everyone would think would be logical and just, given the sort of power that people with guns have, to really sort of mess some things up if things go wrong. That has to be a part of the place forward we move in armed policing, because even sort of the ideas that I'm sort of pushing for and that others are pushing for in Davis still envisions some type of armed law enforcement in the community after those reforms take place. And so we still need to figure out what we're going to do to make sure that that system is not completely unaccountable. And so I think state police bills of rights are a real obstacle to that. But then second, I think going into sort of what a lot of what Lupita was saying, definitely at the beginning, I don't think there is any, true addressing of this without separation or without, without sort of, as you were sort of suggesting in your question, without getting to the defund sort of part of this conversation. Because we spent a good amount of time talking about just traffic stops in general and sort of people's anecdotal or, the data on that. And the reason that there's so much of a problem there is because when I'm driving, through this community, and I see, a black and white vehicle in my rear view, my thought isn't really about, oh, these are people, here to, enforce traffic safety. The thought is like, at sort of least intense, this could be a thing that sort of messes up or ruins my life for a little while, or perpetually, or in the more sort of violent physical sense, this could be a thing that sort of really puts my life in jeopardy. And that's why, eliminating the sort of violent or coercive bias that exists in traffic stops can only exist when that's not an armed law enforcement situation. When the person who is in charge of making sure that people stop at stop signs can't kill you, can't send you to jail, and sort of ruin your family. So that's sort of where I think the path forward is. It exists in accountability that can't really be achieved unless there's some change in state law, but also the separation or the defunding or whatever sort of label we're putting on it. That is definitely a key to removing the very negative bias from the system.
I wanted to get Arthy in on this discussion as well.
Yes, thanks, David. And thank you to, Dillan, yes, echoing everything that you just said, and also just recognizing that it's really difficult to talk about, handling traffic stops in a different way without recognizing that this has to come from divesting from the police, from defunding the police. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a very necessary conversation that we have to have. And, like Dillan, like you mentioned earlier, the separation is really key. I mean, we know that the history of policing in this country has been rooted in racism, and more in modern times, the training for police officers is quite focused on militarization techniques. So, the 2/3 of training for police officers focuses on firearms training and self-defense training, and you have a little less than 1/3 of their training time focused on mediation and de-escalation. And so it really speaks to the fact that you have, at the root of policing itself in the United States, that it's very difficult to parse out how you could maybe come towards traffic stops and addressing it in a very different way, in a soft way, when it's rooted in the police department. So I just want to highlight that separation is really key here, and that separation couldn't happen unless we divest and reinvest in our communities into different social services that really help folks, rather than come at it from a punitive standpoint. So I'd love to talk more about the divesting perspective, but I just wanted to echo what everybody said, especially what Dillan said.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly, because Arthy talked about training, the first thought I think for some people is, they're accidentally a little racist. Let's give them some implicit bias training, right? They just need to know that it's okay, and you just need to do a couple hours of training. And research, genuine academic research has been done that shows time and time again that implicit bias training increases officers' thoughts that they are not being racist. Like you get an increase in how comfortable they are about it, and they feel better, but it doesn't change the outcomes, whether that's in shooting simulators or whether that's in traffic stops. It just doesn't. And so I think that's a major thing to consider when, I think a lot of people's minds go to, okay, well, maybe we could just train them a little bit differently, and they could address this. And so I agree wholeheartedly that separation has to be a part of that conversation, especially since a large part of police, when you go through academy, a large part of the training is specifically, and it's a little crass, but in a direct way, it is just constantly being reminded, this could kill you. Someone could kill you at any moment. They could kill you. And it gets kind of like stamped into your brain that anyone at any moment, it could be a grandma with a shopping cart, or it could be, whatever, that they will pull out a gun and they'll kill you. And I mean, to me, I don't know how you would live that way and not be anxious and not be trigger happy when that's what you've been taught. And that's their formal training, whether that's here in progressive California or whether that's in Alabama, it doesn't matter. That's part of police training. So just thought that was, as far as training goes, yeah, there's a lot to be done.
One thing I think, doesn't get enough focus is that when you're talking about training, you're talking about a limited training course. They have the initial police academy, they have the mandated post training, but you're really talking about people that start out in the profession at 18, right out of high school. Most of them don't have college education. A lot of them aren't coming from diverse places to begin with. And so you're kind of talking about putting lipstick on a pig as opposed to actually creating an environment where you have people that are kind of acting in a more sophisticated way. If you had college graduates who had college equivalent levels of training, not just a few hours of instruction, it would make a big difference, in my opinion.
So last year, I'll just point this out as a tiny story. Hopefully I can be brief. Last year, we obviously training is one of the things that the Police Accountability Commission, for all the reasons that have just been mentioned, is something that we're very interested in. And so we asked to get sort of a walkthrough from the police department of what the training looks like, about sort of what the timeline is, sort of what the concentrations are, just give us an understanding as best as we possibly could have about what the training that a sworn Davis Police Department officer undergoes. And Lieutenant Waltz from the Davis Police Department came to the commission to give us that overview. And David, I just want to underline one of the things that you mentioned that I found really important in that conversation is that, this is weighted way on the front end, that we're talking about, best case scenario. Even if it's a gold mine of training, it's weighted way at the front end at the academy training. And so one of the things that commission members, including myself, were really sort of trying to nail down into is what's sort of the follow-up here. Okay, so you get sort of this training, hey, don't be racist. And then sort of what are we doing in year 2, in year 5, in year 10 to sort of check up on that? Number one, how well are we doing here? Which, you would think would be in sort of any skills training. You're doing that upkeep with the firearms training, right? Like you can't just like do that at the academy and we're never going to check up with you about guns for the rest of your career. That doesn't happen. So it would just seem logical that we would want to follow up on that. Number one, to see what the sort of retention of that information and those skills and those ideas are. But also maybe there's some updates, after a little while as we're learning more and more about how to not be racist as a country and as institutions. But one thing that I think is also important to point out from that walkthrough last year is, goodness, my concern was, it's training, and then just this little tiny itty bit in the middle with all the good stuff. At least in their eyes presenting to us, like this is going to be the stuff that the Police Accountability Commission is going to like. And so it's like this tiny little part that seems like one class that's all the stuff that we care about: de-escalation, implicit bias, a bunch of like 4 things that are like, I think, separate, maybe, probably, just to sort of get a rigorous sort of walkthrough of them, but are sort of all piled together. So my, sort of question that I never really got a good answer to actually is, okay, so all this is weighted in the front, but how substantial is it? Even at that stage in someone's career. So there's much needed upkeep and expansion of how training is given at the front end, but also how it's monitored throughout the life of someone's career as a sworn officer.
One last point on training. I think it's Chris Rock who does a little bit about how if there were American Airlines pilots, if there were just a couple bad apples that were crashing planes and stuff, that we would totally not accept that as a society. And I'm sure I'm not doing Chris Rock any justice with that joke. But the way that I conceptualize it with training too is, to Dillan's point, it feels like to me, when I think about it, we're asking police to, if we'd asked a pilot to fly the plane, also hand out all the drinks and snacks, also do all the repairs on the plane beforehand, also like do the traffic control, make sure he's not crashing into other planes. I mean, there would be so many plane crashes if we asked someone who had a ton of schooling and is an expert, a very good person at their profession, to start doing other professions. And I feel like that's a little bit what happens when we talk about policing, is we've asked police to be experts in not only their profession, which I have to give them credit, they're heroic in and very brave in the dangerous situations that they put themselves in willingly. Any first responder, that's an incredibly difficult job, and I give them all the credit there. I just don't think that they went into it, maybe some of them wanting to be a social worker or wanting to be an addiction counselor or wanting to be an EMT, wanting to be a medic, insert whatever that is there. That's just not what what they've had training on. It's not their schooling. And so I think it seems a little odd to put that all on them. And it's actually, if you think about it from the police's perspective, I would think very unfair. And you would have pilots crashing a lot of planes and probably being pissed off about their job if that's how we structured it. So.
Well, and I think Dillan's point is well taken, that what they want to do is shoot their guns, right? So they spend lots of time with target practice, even though 99% of police officers never fire their gun in their entire career. But they don't spend a lot of time on the other stuff because that's not their priority. The other thing I would suggest, not just to you guys, but to the people listening to this, so one thing the Vanguard has been doing for the last 10 years now is we're actually sending interns and going into court. And so over the course of 10 years, we've probably covered at least 10 counties worth of courts, and we've seen probably thousands of cases at this point. We see police officers on the stand all the time. And, it's interesting, like if you talk to a police officer and say, well, I've seen police officers take the stand and it's kind of scary. And they go, well, a good defense attorney can make anyone look bad. Well, first of all, that's not necessarily true. Most defense attorneys don't make most witnesses look bad. And second of all, it's only when you're challenged, when somebody asks you tough questions that you can't answer, that you realize how little you actually know. And so I think, if people saw what we've seen for the last 10 years, they'd be a lot more scared about the caliber of policing than maybe they are now. So I do want to get to defund the police, even though we're kind of running up against the hour mark here. But, and you guys have actually really talked about it without kind of putting it all on the table. But what is defund the police, and what do you think in terms of like a co-responder model versus a CAHOOTS model? What do you see working?
Yeah. So I just want to highlight, like, the idea of defunding the police really is about redirecting resources to better support services that actively help people live healthier, fuller, more wholesome lives. And so another way to think about defunding the police is to think of it as divesting from the current police budget to reinvest into our communities. So as it stands right now, we dedicate just, across the country, and certainly Davis is no exception, we dedicate a huge amount of funding to the police budget and expect the police to respond to many crisis situations that could just be better handled by social services, like calls concerning mental health, substance use disorders, etc. And so I think the idea of divesting and reinvesting really allows for us to redirect this money from over-reliance on policing and directing it towards funding programs that better serve our community's needs. So for example, if we were able to divest from the police and use that funding to create and or grow existing mental health social services, that could be housed in a completely separate department from the police to respond to those who are in crisis and get them the help that they need. So that's what really defunding the police means, is that you're taking the existing funds and redistributing it in a way that benefits everybody as a community. In regards to CAHOOTS and the co-responder model, so the co-responder model is basically a model where the basic framework is that you have a police officer, right, an armed police officer, plus a mental health professional, mental health / substance use disorder professional that respond to 911 service calls. Typically, the police officer has undergone a CIT training, which is a crisis intervention training. And this training is about 40 hours. And I just want to pause here and say, there's professionals in the famous CAHOOTS unarmed response program where they undergo 500 hours of on-the-field training. So if you just compare that, CAHOOTS versus CIT training for police officers, 40 hours versus 500 hours, it's a huge difference. And just also letting it sink in that there is a lot of complexity when it comes to handling and really compassionately serving our community members who are dealing with mental health crises like substance use disorders and who are homeless. And so that's one tenet. And so the CAHOOTS program really, kind of steps in and says, hey, instead of having an armed police officer with a mental health professional arrive at the scene, what if we just have a mobile unit that consists of a mental health professional / substance use disorder professional plus a medic arrive at the scene, and with a lot of compassion, 500 hours of on the field training for de-escalation, mediation, support this person in crisis, direct them to existing social services that exist in, for example, Eugene and Springfield, Oregon, and get them the help they need. And so this is really important, right? Because you have co-responder models that still have police officers that arrive at the scene. And the thing about that is that it can be really triggering for people who've already had unfortunate, experiences with police officers in the past. And that can actually serve to only escalate the situation. Additionally, co-responder models, they found that the clinicians who serve with police officers in these teams, the clinicians find that they don't get the privacy that they really need to address the client or the patient's needs, and perhaps the police officer is a little bit rash or rushes the decision on handing them off to a service, and so the service that the client or the patient really needs isn't really addressed. And so that's kind of why an unarmed response that really has a holistic and a large amount of training from a compassionate rather than a punitive standpoint is super important.
Yeah, and just to quickly add to those CAHOOTS model or EMT ambulance-based models, which don't necessarily with every call involve a police officer, it's not as if, because I think this is the criticism that happens, right, is A, you won't find clinicians who want to do that work. And then B, if you do find them, they will accidentally go to calls that are really violent and they'll get hurt. And so built into, we're smart people who are making these programs, built into that program is the ability to call law enforcement if the situation necessitates it. And if a situation involves mental health, clearly, or involves substance use or something like that, but is immediately recognized by a dispatcher as completely needs an armed response, that gets overridden and it goes to an armed response, right? So there's a lot of logical step-ins for when you do actually genuinely require force and that armed presence. But when you don't, and when it makes more sense to not have it, that's when you would not send an officer. And then they can be doing better things with their time, right? You know?
Just to like expand a little bit on the sort of structural defund part, and just to sort of second both of Arthy's and Morgan's comments there, because that was actually Morgan all of what I was about to say about the co-responder model. So we're talking about sort of moving things that exist, like, so my usual list is a list of 4: a response to mental health crises, support to people who are experiencing some sort of substance use issue, outreach to people who are homeless, and traffic enforcement. That some of those are already in the department in sort of neatly packaged sort of units that we maybe can imagine sort of just picking up and dropping off somewhere else. This year, you could think of maybe the homeless outreach program, which currently just has 2 people in them who are non-sworn, who are not sworn Davis Police Department officers. Sort of landing places that I have suggested and I think are sort of, moving around in people's heads seems to be one of 3 options that we could envision putting some of these things in a separate existing department. For instance, the city of Berkeley has, I believe, has proposed, I don't think they're really far down the process, but has proposed sort of housing their traffic enforcement and public works in their existing public works department. I don't know if that would be the best solution here, but that's, that's sort of how something like that could work. There's a lot of people who are really focused, and I am partial to this idea as well, of putting some of these services in a completely brand new separate department, some sort of, Department of Public Safety or community, whatever. And then I think particularly as we're considering the delivery of mental health services, which always, at least in California, requires cooperation with the county, that we explore some sort of joint powers authority with neighboring communities like Woodland and the other cities in cooperation with the county to deliver those mental health services. And y'all basically said all of what I was going to say about the co-responder model, but I'll just sort of round out a couple of other things in that it makes me nervous in general. I think, to a lot of what Morgan said about this being a lot about the triaging process at dispatch. You call 911 and you say what? You say what's happening, you say where it is. The dispatcher tries to get some details from you because there's already a sort of a triage process. Now it only has 2 options, police or fire. But what is sort of envisioned here is that, we're adding some more options to that menu for the dispatcher. And if we are talking about, a situation where someone is in some degree of mental distress that's not violent and doesn't seem to be a threat to someone, relative to the call that the dispatcher gets, then we don't need to send co-responder, or we don't need to send an officer individually. That's probably a case that just requires a trained mental health professional. But I think there are going to be some tricky cases where it's going to be, even with the best training, even with 5 billion hours of training for a dispatcher, going to be cases where it's hard to sort of come down, this is definitely a police or definitely a sort of a social services issue. And I think that is a scenario where we might want to think about deploying a co-responder model. Even though I'm not, it doesn't inspire a lot of comfort with me. But I think that's sort of my thoughts on how we deliver those things.
If I could interject, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, we're just about out of time. Lupita, I was actually gonna ask if you had anything to add.
I do. I'm actually looking at this article from ABC News, and it basically gives a good perspective on how the Camden Police Force had worked to actually, they worked with the help of the New York University Policing Project. They went and developed a comprehensive model with the ACLU of New Jersey and the Fraternal Order of Police. And when they disbanded their police department in 2013, by 2019, the number of homicides dropped to 25%. And that was a decline of nearly 63% from 2012. And so they did, I mean, it was hard. They did have some resistance. Some police left because they were just like, I'm not going to do this. But, you know, it's a potential model for police reform. And they basically rebuilt their police department from the ground up. And so it's not undoable, and it improved community relations, and they were able to have meals with the community and participate and be included in the community. And it wasn't like a separate thing where the community were the other and the police were someone else. And so I think one of the first steps we can do is supporting the local voices, collecting the testimonials from the community, because I think that not along with the research and demographics, I think that people need to hear what has happened to them. And once they hear the horrific stories coming out of Davis, some of which I've personally witnessed, and understand the severity of the problem. Because if you're rich and white in Davis, you're gonna have a great relationship with the police. They're amazing to you, they're lovely, they really are great people. But if you're poor and you're going through a rough spot and you're like a first-time nonviolent offender in Yolo County, your life will be ruined, especially if you don't have a lawyer. And that's something that, you know, why should the criminal justice system protect in Yolo County only the rich people that are able to afford lawyers? Why do we need a lawyer to be protected? And so we need to look at things and, you know, not only just, you know, with the police reform, but also with rehabilitative programs, you know, shutting down the juvenile detention centers, reformative justice, things of that nature. I used to volunteer doing gardens in the prisons in Solano County. I was only able to, before COVID, attend one time. But, you know, they had programs, they taught the incarcerated about green job trainings, how to grow food. You know, you need to empower people. And one thing I do want to say that I did get a suggestion to say that research supports that investing in education and employment helps lower crime rates. So we need to look at, going back to the research, what works, what doesn't. The answers are out there. We just need to be open to accept them.
Thank you, Lupita. So we're gonna wrap up here, and I want to thank everyone for coming out and sharing your experiences. This is obviously a critical issue. I hope that this level of discussion is happening not only community-wide in this city, but also statewide and nationwide, because it really needs to be happening. And I'm hoping that people listening to this can see that this is a very sober discussion. There wasn't like a bunch of you know, foot stamping radicalism going on here. Rather, it's a bunch of concerned citizens expressing very level-headed concerns and putting forward what I think are pretty modest proposals to help improve the process. So this has been Everyday Injustice. I am your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.